It's not just you today, eh, John? It's both of you.
It is me for the live stream, but not for the radio show. Jen
Yeah,
will be
Jen
back
coming
for
back
in the
after.
afternoon,
The next one.
Yeah.
hopefully.
Okay.
So you can just use the PowerPoint and talking head one, and we can. So
Yep.
you don't need the dual one.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I was just waiting for her to come in so we can make sure her audio worked, all that stuff. So if she's not coming, then I'm not gonna worry about it.
No, you don't need to worry about it. Not until 1:45. And then I think if you guys are okay with it, let's do the other the pre-record right after.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We'll maybe take
Okay.
after the radio, maybe take a 5 minute break, go get a pop, but then we'll come
Yeah,
right
yeah,
back
yeah,
and
of
do it. Yeah.
course.
Okay.
And then after that, let's do a quick discussion on tomorrow, and just so we're all on the
Yeah, we'll
same
do that.
page,
Yeah.
right? And then just to that way we can fine tune the script, and
Sounds
then the
good.
script's nailed down because it's 20 minutes, not 30 now, right?
What? Oh
We
wow.
only have 20 minutes. That's what
Okay.
she said.
Well, that makes it way more. See, now I'm nervous for that. I don't care about 30. Don and I have filled one in Toronto. We filled an hour and a half. We got cut off.
Now we're done.
They're like, could you wrap it up? Because once Don and I get going, we may start slow. We finish strong because we just know our stuff, right?
Just talking points will help you get.
And we're just. Like Don's my guy. We'll just chat and joke, but there's really good knowledge. After every time we do these group things, people come up. That was so interesting. Like that's so
Yep.
crazy how you guys approach it. And it's like, oh, thank you. But 20
Every
is like,
time,
this will
Tony,
be the
it
shortest
happens.
we've ever talked on.
Yep.
Okay,
Like
yeah, that's
you
fun.
and I
That's a
remember
new
I told you
challenge.
I was at the food court across the street from PDAC there, and the guy ahead of me in the lineup at the Mediterranean restaurant goes, "Oh, I loved your presentation." I'm like, "Oh my
Oh,
gosh!"
yeah, thank you.
And he just said because he said you guys all know each other, it's obvious and it's natural, so it's a
Because we work together, yeah.
conversation. Yeah, and
See,
he said it's just so much more interesting and engaging than a PowerPoint, right?
see, live stream. See all you live streamers listening to us right now. We put in the work behind the scenes to keep it interesting for you. We really are trying. So hope you guys know that.
Exactly.
All right, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Unless you have more to say.
No, you can
Okay.
take control of your
Nothing
studio.
further.
Yeah. Give you 2 minutes here to get your head in the game, and I'm gonna go silent here in the studio. And
It's already in the game.
all right, awesome. We'll catch you on the other side. Have a good show.
Okay.
Showdown.
Thanks. afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as the project moves into consultation round 3 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities or are of community importance, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. No co-host for our live stream this morning, but Jen will be joining me for the radio show this afternoon, so she'll be back very soon. So let's get started. Today's topic is an interesting one, I think, for a lot of community members. It's called the floating road. And in this show, we will be talking about building the road in Muskeg, the James Bay lowlands. We think it's important to discuss these topics and share those discussions with you, our viewers and listeners. And I just want to remind everyone that the recording of this live stream will be posted on our website as well later on. So why don't we get started now and just do a quick run through of the topics we're going to cover today. We're going to lead off, as we normally do, with a project background just to get everybody up to the same level of knowledge about the project. And then following that, we're going to talk about what Muskeg is. And then we're going to get to sort of the heart of the top of today's topic and talk about road construction in Muskeg. We know this is an interesting topic for people, and we've developed some visuals and even a physical model that I'll tell you about later on to help explain how the road would be built in these challenging areas. And then finally, we're going to talk about uh, how to get in touch with us to learn more about the project or to ask any questions or comments that you may have. So let's move on now and talk a little bit about the project location. Webequie First Nation is about 200 to 250 kilometers from both the James Bay and the Hudson Bay coasts. So it is about 600 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, almost due north of Thunder Bay as well. So it's definitely in northern Ontario. And the planned road is planned to run from the airport in Webequie southeast to east of the Mukatai River near McFalls Lake, which is also considered to be what's called the Ring of Fire mineral area. So let's now move on and talk a little bit about the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road. So there's three main purposes of the road. The first being to move materials, supplies, and people from the airport in Webequie to the McFalls Lake area. The second, to provide employment and economic development opportunities to the community members of Webequie, but allowing them to preserve and enhance their culture at the same time and live in their communities, of course. And then finally, another purpose of the road is to provide work experience, and training opportunities for youth, for the young people, to help encourage them to pursue additional education or additional skills through education and training. In terms of the project itself, I always say that this is more than just a 2-lane gravel road. There are other components to it, which I'll get into. The planned length of the road is 107 kilometers. And then 17 of those kilometers are actually sit on Webequie First Nation reserve lands. Now, the corridor, the actual corridor, road corridor itself, which is sort of like our planning zone, is 2 kilometers wide. So we now have a preferred corridor for the road. So the road will sit somewhere inside that 2 kilometer wide corridor. And this preferred corridor was identified after a long process involving um, technical experts but primarily the community members identifying where they would like the road, and based mainly on the constraints that they're more familiar with than anyone else. And then finally, the cleared area for the road would be 35 meters in width. So that's the final corridor width or right of way. And next, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those other things that make this more than just a road. There are 3 major watercourse crossings. The first one coming out of Webequie is that crossing the Winnisk Lake, which is about 250 meter span. And then the second crossing is southeast of there, and that's the crossing of the Winnisksis Channel, which is between 30 and 40 meters wide. And then finally, the last major crossing is the crossing of the Mukattai River at the east end of the road, almost at the end of the road, and that's again 30 to 40 meters in width. There will be both permanent and temporary aggregate pits in rock quarry areas. These are to supply materials to build the road with. As such, they require access roads to get to them. And so these access roads would have to be built. Again, they'd be temporary for the temporary facilities, permanent for the permanent facilities. And then the access roads might have to cross water courses, so water crossing structures, whether it's a culvert or if it's a larger crossing, and then it might require a bridge. And then finally, or almost finally, there are construction camps. And so these construction camps, I think there's planned to be 4 of them along the route. And these are to accommodate the construction crews. And they also, associated with them are the typical infrastructure to support those, that's part of those camps, which would be a wastewater treatment plant and then a drinking water storage area as well too. And then typically associated with the camps, you have what you call storage and laydown yards, and then these would be temporary for the storage and laydown of equipment and materials. I must also note that there will be permanent operations and maintenance facilities. I don't know how many, probably 2 located at different locations along the route. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of the project itself. Now let's move into the core of the presentation and talk a little bit about what is muskeg. So probably 60% of the 107 kilometers run through the planned Webequie Supply Road, run through what we call muskeg. And so this muskeg is part of what makes up the James Bay lowlands. So the question is, what is muskeg? Well, the Cree word for muskeg is maskek, and then the Ojibwe word is mashgig, meaning grassy bog. So how to best describe muskeg? Well, I guess there's a bunch of different ways to describe muskeg. It's as a simple description, it's characterized by being wet, lots of vegetation, and then it has peat deposits, which is decayed plant matter, underlaying it. So it includes a lot of different types of what we call wetlands. So they could be bogs, fens, swamps, and mires, and they all have specific definitions that describe what these are. Um, Another good description, I think, of muskeg is a floating mat of vegetation. So when you walk on it, it's very spongy or squishy. So it's very, very saturated. And sometimes you can sink quite a bit when you walk on it. Um, But the interesting thing to note about muskeg is that the water underneath is actually flowing, and it's flowing in a direction uh, through this muskeg. So even though when you look at, if you look at the picture on our slide here, you wouldn't think there's water underneath there, but there is. There is water underneath there. That is actually muskeg, and so it's a bit of a deceiving kind of landscape. But again, it takes different forms. There are open water sections of muskeg as well, and I'll show you some photos of those a little bit later on. But it's as you can imagine, um, working and trying to do field work in muskeg is not easy to do, and especially when things aren't frozen, because you can't move very quickly and you can get really wet. So if we move to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the water flow. And I mentioned this a bit earlier, that there is water there, even though it may not necessarily always look like it, but it's there and it's moving, but it's moving very slowly. So it's moving through all that vegetation. And when when you're building a road through these areas, because there's flowing water there, what you have to do, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, is make sure that you allow that water to continue to flow. Because if you don't, what you're building is essentially a dam. And so it's blocking the movement of the water, and then you get a buildup of water on one side of the road. And then eventually what will happen is that water will build up to a point and then find a release point, and then that will typically wash out sections of road, which is not good because then the road can't be used to get from one place to another. So in order to build a road properly through the muskeg, you've got to account for this fact that the water is flowing, and it has to be allowed to flow, not just for physical reasons, but also for biological reasons, to allow it to behave biologically like it did before. So let's now move to road construction in muskeg. And as I mentioned, this is kind of a tricky. It's a bit of a tricky business, but there's some good examples out there, fortunately, of how to do this properly. And these examples are not that far away. I know there's a very good example in Manitoba of a similar all-season road that was built through muskeg, and so this road has been around for at least 7 years, and so they've been monitoring the behavior of this road since they built it, and everything's looking positive. So let's talk a bit about that road foundation design. Um, there's two really main areas to the Webequie Supply Road in terms of the landforms that the general landforms that the road travels through. So the western part, the part closest to Webequie itself, probably 40 to 50 kilometers, sits in what you would call upland areas. And these upland areas, even though they're not particularly upland-like, they're still fairly low and flat, have fairly good uh, soil conditions. But the east half of the road, in the lowland areas, in the James Bay lowland areas, or the peatland or muskeg areas, has poor to very poor soil conditions for building a road. So that means you have to build the road in a different way. And so there's different techniques involved. There's more materials involved. There's more design work involved as well too. So the road in the lowland areas has to be designed as what we call a floating road. So when we say floating, it means it sits on top of what's already there. So we're not excavating the peat, which is that decayed plant material that sits underneath the muskeg or makes up the muskeg. Um, That's not excavated. You're actually building on top of it. So the road doesn't really float on the peat, but what happens is when the road is being built, when well, for example, when the rock is pushed onto that peat, it compresses the peat. So what happens is you get a shrinkage. So that rock sinks down, puts pressure on the peat to the point where it comes into balance with the strength of the peat. So you get this sort of what you call it equilibrium. So um, you get an equilibrium, sort of a balance between the weight of the road and how strong the peat is. And so what happens is once you get that, then you've got the road base sort of in a stable situation, and then you build on top of that. Um, so, and then what else? Another thing that's used in building the road is you have to use something. It's a they call it a geotextile fabric or a geogrid layer, and that's placed on top of the peat before the first layers of rock go on top. And that what that does is to sort of give a platform to work on, and it evenly distributes, it spreads the load of the material placed on it. So the idea is that if you use that fabric or the geogrid, it it allows the road to behave sort of like a snowshoe, where that load is spread out over a wider area, so it doesn't. If you imagine wearing snowshoes in the snow, you don't sink as much when you have snowshoes because you have a wide platform, so that load is spread out over a wider area. So that's kind of the principle. That's kind of the principle behind road design in these muskeg areas. In terms of the like a cross section of it, and I know these can sometimes be hard to interpret if we move to the next slide, but um, so if you imagine we cut a slice through the road and then we have a look at it, this will give you an idea. The upper one shows how the road is sort of built in the higher areas, the areas what we call the upland areas, and then how it's built in the lowland areas. So it's a different kind of approach, different kind of material being used depending on where you're building it. In the lower cross section, we're actually going to be using larger rock in the as sort of the sub base, and the larger rock is used because we want the water to flow through the road. Because remember that water, as I mentioned, that's in the muskeg, it's flowing, so you can't block that water. So you use culvert pipes, so those pipes to allow the water to flow through. But you can also use the bigger rocks that have bigger spaces between them as your sub base for the road, and then the water can flow through there, and that works pretty effectively. This next slide gives you a couple of examples. Actually, if we can move to the next slide. Yeah. Well, there's one before that. Yeah, that's the one. This should give people an idea. It's not pretty building roads in muskeg. It's very challenging to do. But if you look at this photo here, you'll see this big sheet that's laid out. That's that geotextile fabric that's laid out first on top of the peat, and then the rock is pushed on top of it. So that sheet sits on top of the peat to sort of allow that peat to behave sort of as a unit, so you don't get these sort of localized failures of the road. It helps the road behave in a more uniform way. Um, and so then the rock gets pushed on top of the fabric. Sometimes there's another layer of fabric on top of that rock to reinforce the road even more. So that's basically how it's done. So, and the reason why is because the reason why we build on top of the peat is because the peat is too thick and it doesn't drain well to be. So it's you don't want to excavate it because of that, for many other reasons as well too. Um, So that's why we call it a floating road. And then we've also done surveys through along the route of the road using what's called ground penetrating radar. And this technology allows you to sort of figure out what's underneath the ground, like what types of material. And so based on those surveys, we've identified thicknesses of between 1 and 5 meters of peat. So in the areas where there's more peat, thicker areas of peat, more needs to be put into the road, more material needs to be used, more uh, it just requires more care, and but mainly more material because you're sitting on that a much thicker layer of peat. So it makes it a little bit less stable. So you've got to do a little bit extra because when you're building the road base, that peat layer will get squished by 40 to 45%. So if you imagine, what happens is they push that rock over the sheet which lays over top of the peat. You get then you get that rock then sinks by 40 to 45%, and then you build on top of that. And that's how you end up with like a fairly stable base for the road. And again, as I mentioned, that rock subbase allows, the rocks are big enough to allow the water to flow through the spaces between the rocks, so you don't get that backup of water on one side, and then, which can continue to occur and then end up blowing out sections of the road. So another thing that's also done is more culverts are used as well too, and those culverts are used to keep that flow going, right? And they're used more in the slightly open water areas, as you'll see in the next slide. If we can move to the next slide. So this next slide shows kind of two scenarios. You've got the road going through a vegetated section of muskeg, and then there's an open water section in the muskeg. And so what they've done is they've used the rock subbase in the vegetated area, and then they've used a combination of the rock subbase in the open water area. They've used a combination of the rock subbase with the culverts, in this case, 2 double culverts, to make sure that that flow gets through there, so you don't get this buildup. So this example is actually from Manitoba, and this is the project I was referring to earlier, where they've had, their design has held up really well. Um, and so our design will be quite similar to that as well. So you can see there are challenges building in muskeg. It's not easy, but it's definitely doable. Um, it just requires more material, a little bit more design and thought put into it. It's a little bit more challenging, actually, the physical construction of it, just because of the environment that you're working in, because there's so much water there. But it's been done before many times, and people are getting more and more sophisticated at it. And when the final design is developed, we've done preliminary design, but when the final design is developed, I can assure you that it'll be based on the best examples that we can find out there to make sure that this road lasts as long as possible. So I hope that was helpful to everyone today. This is a big topic. I will tell you that we have just recently developed what you call a physical model of the muskeg. So if you can imagine like a model railway where you build sort of a landscape in miniature, we've done the same thing of building the road through the muskeg. So we have this model that we've prepared, and soon we're going to be able to take this with us when we go on the road and as part of round 3 and meet communities. We can take this model with us and show them how the road would be built in muskeg, and I think that'll hopefully help people understand that better. We also have some animations and other visuals that should help people understand better how the road will be built through these areas as well. So that wraps up today's discussion of the floating road. We hope it was helpful. And we hope it encourages you to join us again next week at the exact same time when we're going to talk about the post EA and IA approval monitoring and compliance. So we're going to talk about what happens once you get that environmental assessment approval or impact assessment approval. What happens after that? What is this monitoring and compliance? What are examples of monitoring and compliance? So hopefully that'll be a topic you're interested in and you'll join us for next week. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, supplyroad.ca. Miigwech, and we will talk to you again next week.